We are live.
We are live. Great. Welcome everyone to this MCNPro Google Hangout, Photogrammetry Museums. I want to welcome you all. I'm glad you tuned in. This is a new platform for us. MCN is trying to connect with members and other people in the community in between conferences. So the Digital Imaging Special Interest Group, I'm the chair of that SIG, and my co-chair, also Kurt Miller at British Art Center, is here as well. And we have some guests, and we're going to basically talk about an update on a presentation that we did last year at the conference in Minneapolis, where we discussed a collaboration between the Minneapolis Institute of Art and the University of Minnesota, computer scientists led by Professor Gary Meyer, who you'll meet in a minute. Gary approached us because not only does he have a lot of experience in computer graphics over the years, but he also has a great interest in art and culture, and he noticed, of course, that we have a lot of good content that we could apply to some of the techniques that they were developing with photogrammetry. So we're going to talk a little bit about that collaboration, and I think right now maybe I just will give everybody, what I'll do is I'll give everybody a chance to introduce themselves, and then I'll come back and I'll give you a brief introduction of the specific project that we're applying these techniques to at the museum, which is a Chinese bronze project. So we're also joined by Carla Schroer, who is from Cultural Heritage Imaging, who has trained many of the people in the museum field on photogrammetry, and in fact sparked our interest in it originally. So she's here as a special guest and also a collaborator. So why don't we start with my colleague Charles Walbridge, who's the lead collection photographer at the museum, and he can introduce himself. And then we'll go to Gary and the people at the university. We're still waiting for one guest, Seth Meyer from the University of Wisconsin. Will be joining us. He's at a meeting right now, but he should tune in, and then we'll get started. So Charles, why don't you introduce yourself first to our guests?
Sure. All right, Kurt, are you going to switch?
Oh,
switch.
Sure. There you go.
I see you, Charles. I think you're switched to
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Charles. I'm the lead collections photographer here at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and we do all sorts of photography here in the studio, including the photogrammetry that you'll see in the on our turntable workstation back here. What else, Dan? Is there anything else?
I think that's it.
Right.
We'll hear from you more in a moment. So let's go to Gary.
Hi, I'm Gary Meyer. I'm a faculty member in computer science at the University of Minnesota, and as Dan said, we've been doing some work in image-based rendering over the years, and I learned of the work at the Minneapolis Institute of Art that they were actually doing some photogrammetry work, so I got in touch with them, and what you're going to see is the result of our collaboration over the last couple of years.
And how about Michael, who's been key to this project too? Michael Tetzlaff.
I'm a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and I've been working with Gary Meyer. And I've also been working closely with people at the Minneapolis Institute of Art too.
And Carla Schroer, who I briefly introduced, but Carla, why don't you say hi?
Hi, I'm Carla Schroer, and I'm a director at Cultural Heritage Imaging. We're a nonprofit based in San Francisco and focusing on computational photography for cultural sites, museums, archives, libraries, and we are working quite a bit in photogrammetry, but also reflectance transformation imaging, some spectral imaging, and other fun stuff. And thanks for including me.
Yeah, and then my co-chair at the Digital Imaging SIG is Kurt Miller. Why don't you say hi, Kurt?
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm Kurt Miller. I'm at the Center for British Art. We're just starting dabbling with photogrammetry, but I'm going to be here kind of manning the switching and also answering any Q&As. There is the little Q&A feature, so if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to ask them, and at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers.
Okay, great. I also want to apologize to everyone for some of the confusion. You know, we're working across time zones. It was the starting time for this hangout was posted in a number of different time zones, and therefore it led to some confusion. But hopefully, we're all here now, and we can get started. So, of course, you know, this is an exciting time to be involved in imaging, and museum imaging especially. And we have a lot of, this is a new frontier where we are, you know, forging through with some, you know, lots of new techniques that are coming down the pike these days. And you know, photogrammetry being one of the more exciting ones. So I wanted to talk about a project that, and I'm going to share my screen with you here for a second. Okay, here we go. And now, share. Okay, and then I'm going to go back to that window and make it full screen for you so you can see it. And that goes present. So does everybody see that screen?
Yep.
So this is a collection. The museum has a notable collection of ancient Chinese bronze vessels. And we've organized, or are organizing an exhibition and 2-volume catalog that the exhibition will be here and open here in 2018. And so, of course, there's been a lot of research over the last couple of years, and photography has been an important part of that. And but also, we've brought scholars in to study the work, do examinations. And one of the things they were doing, these 2 experts came from China. That's up in the upper right-hand of your screen, you see Dr. Yang Lu, who's our curator of Chinese art here at the museum. And he engaged these experts who were doing rubbings and very detailed drawings and measurements of the objects. And while this was going on, we realized that you know, Charles and I were experimenting with photogrammetry, and we realized that this was the perfect subject matter for photogrammetry, because they're you know, they're bronze, but they have a heavy patina on them, so they're not highly reflective, but they're, of course, they're 3D. And you know, what we were doing before, we had made, you know, some 2,000 photographs of the objects, because the scholars who were studying the objects around the world wanted, you know, details of the inside, and they wanted all the inscriptions, and they wanted, of course, all the various views. And so we thought, well, this is a perfect time to bring photogrammetry into the mix. And we were very fortunate because we had the support of a trustee who helped us purchase the machine, or we call him Edward, after Edward Muybridge, the great innovator in photography. It's basically a turntable. It's made by a company called Snap 36, and that helps us move through photographing these quite quickly, because it has a turntable and an arm that moves up, and you know, we capture quite a few images to get the full range of views to use in photogrammetry. So I think that's an appropriate time to maybe turn it over to Charles, who is going to show you some of the content that we've created to this point, and talk a little bit about the process before we move on to the techniques that Gary and Michael and their colleague Seth, who we hope will still be joining us today. They've developed some extensions onto the AgiSoft software, which really enhances particularly the specularity of the objects. And so we'll be sharing some of them. Why don't you kind of do an overview of the project as you've been working on it, Charles?
Sure. So I'm also going to share my screen. Hold on just a minute. And here are my photos. And full screen, hold on. All right, is that full screen for you guys?
No, but I see it quite good.
All right. The turntable that we have, as Dan said, is made by, it's actually made by Photoromat.com, which is a Czech company, but Snap36 is the US reseller for them. And it's a 36-inch turntable that is, it's internet connected, so we can control it from the app on the PC. And it holds, you know, up to 450 pounds, and we've never gotten close to testing that weight limit. But the camera is that's connected to the system is on a swing arm. Can you see that?
Right in the
Did
middle.
photo change?
No.
All right, hold on. What do you guys see, Kurt?
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah, that's it.
The camera is with the turntable is on a pedestal, and it's on a swing arm, and so you can set its point of rotation anywhere you want around the object. And so we've taken the Qi photogrammetry workflow and modified it for this kind of shooting space, and used the application that Photorobot and Snap36 use to control the camera and and how many pictures it takes and in what direction it swings. And so we can do anywhere from 200 to 700 images of an object, and we do top and bottom when we can, and we do the inside of these objects when we can. And so we're figuring out the best ways to image all of this stuff and still get it to be dimensionally accurate. So that's an overview of the turntable. Do you want to hear about the shooting the project right now, or you want to skip to something else?
Why don't you continue on, and then
All right.
we'll come back to you maybe when we go to the sharing portion of it.
So we have our workflow set up where we can figure out with an object like this that you know, that we're going to do a row of 36 images, and then we're going to move the camera up 10 degrees, and we're going to do another row of 36 images. And we have, in the application, we have an auto-naming system, so we can see, you know, what row and what column all of these different images come from. And from that, and from the underside photos and the inside photos, we can assemble all of these in PhotoScan and make different chunks in PhotoScan to best render the object as accurately as possible. So we have a regular file and folder naming convention that we use, and we're going to be talking to Carla in the next few weeks about her her photogrammetry toolkit, and to see if we can revise that at all and make it even more universal than it is now. So in the process, each of these images is you know, tagged with our accession number and some other information, and they're all exported as JPEGs, and then they're all loaded into PhotoScan either as a single chunk, is what PhotoScan calls it, a single object, or as multiple ones that we'll combine later. Let's see, we sometimes photograph the empty background so that PhotoScan can auto-mask them, but we've found that it's not always necessary. And we use a really flat lighting technique here. You know, you can see that it's an outlined, mostly outlined. We still want a little bit of dimension on the object, but we find PhotoScan does very well with this very flat light. And one of the things we've recently added to our workflow here is we've switched from strobes to LED lights, and so we have 4 of these Mole Richardson soft lights that that are 5,000 degrees Kelvin and just very nice lights, so we're not running, you know, thousands and thousands of flashes through our strobe units, which we really didn't want to do. You can see that we're using a Canon. It's a 5D Mark II, and we think that the 22 megapixels is a good medium amount of resolution. When we do our photogrammetry of paintings or of sculptures in the gallery, we actually switch to our 40 or 80 megapixel cameras because we do so many fewer images that we like to have that many more pixels. And both those, a few 80 megapixel images or a lot of 20 megapixel images we feel like they're reasonable processing times in PhotoScan. And then when we come over we set up a special machine to be our PhotoScan processing station, partly because the Snap36 software only runs on PC. So we set up a PC that was, a fraction of the price of a Mac Pro tower, and we're running a lot of things there. But then we've also, through this same trustee and sponsorship, I guess, we're starting to run a server that just runs PhotoScan stuff. So they've donated an old server that used to process information for them, and it's got 80 processing threads and a terabyte of RAM, and so we end up running some pretty big projects through there. And I think we're still going to run some stuff for Carla in the future.
Yes, that'll be great.
Right, and then this week that was through a company named a local company called Thomson Reuters, who is a data processing company. And they're also, this week, we've noticed that one of the issues was certain steps in the AgiSoft process, PhotoScan process, required pretty significant GPU time, or power, processing power. So they're bringing over some 2 new GPUs for us to hook up this week. So we're really hoping to significantly improve our time once that's installed. So you may have noticed that Seth Barrier, professor at University of Wisconsin, Stout, has joined us. So maybe why don't you give us we all introduce ourselves, Seth, why don't you just take a minute to introduce yourself, and then we'll go over to Gary. Your microphone's off, Seth.
You're
Can you
muted,
hear me
Seth.
now?
There we go.
That's better. Good. Well, thank you, Dan. Yes, my apologies for being a little bit late here. My name's Seth, and I work in Wisconsin, in Menominee, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin Stout. I'm a former colleague, Professor Meyer, so we have a lot of similar research interests. And for my part, I'm very interested in trying to find faster ways of processing the data that's collected, which is what I'm going to be talking about later today. Some different software that we're developing. We're also looking into our own ways to capture this, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the threads that will be going in that direction as well.
Great. So why don't we go to Gary and Michael, and you guys can talk about the unstructured light field viewer that enhances the scans that we're capturing with PhotoScan.
Okay. So I'll just start off by a couple words of introduction. So we had been building light field rendering software for other purposes in my research group, and we'd actually, because we didn't have access to the kind of sophisticated, oops, why don't you just hold that, Michael, for a second? Because we didn't have access to the kind of sophisticated photographic setups that some other computer graphics labs were using a virtual setup. We were kind of synthesizing pictures and then feeding them into the light field renderer. And we realized, in part by talking to others and to the Minneapolis Institute of Art, that AgiSoft PhotoScan was an ideal way of feeding digital information into our unstructured lumograph rendering system. So we had the back end to the AgiSoft, and AgiSoft is always the front end. And what I want to talk to you about today, show you, is this back end process for the AgiSoft PhotoScan pipeline. So with that, let's switch control over to Michael Tetzlaff, and we're going to, okay. So I'm going to show you as a video that demonstrates the process by which we attach ourselves onto the AgiSoft PhotoScan pipeline. So you start off by taking photographs of the object as usual. Here are these photographs taken with the robot at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Feed them into AgiSoft PhotoScan, and it does its processing to determine the camera positions and also give you back a mesh representation for the object. and all that should be familiar to many of you who are listening today. You feed the mesh and the camera positions and the original photographs into our unstructured lumograph renderer, and it then does the interpolation amongst not the processed images that PhotoScan provides, but amongst the original photographs that were taken. So you get back the baked-in lighting that was there and the better representation of the surface reflection than you get with the processed images that PhotoScan uses for its rendering process. Here's another example. You can see with this urn, there's a highlight that's not present when you use the PhotoScan results, but when you go to the unstructured lumograph, you get back that highlight that was there because of the photographic lighting setup that was used to photograph the object. I should say that all of these images all those videos that you're seeing were screen captured in real time from our unstructured lumograph renderer that's running on a workstation. And what I want to do now to just sort of emphasize the difference between what you get with the unstructured lumograph versus PhotoScan, go to another example of a silk cap that was also in the collection of the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Now here's one static shot that you get back from the textures that PhotoScan generates. Now PhotoScan processes the pictures to facilitate finding the camera positions. That's why it changes the photographs, because it wants to get rid of the highlights and it wants to diminish it wants to basically make the object as diffuse as possible because it facilitates the process of finding the camera correspondences. Now if you go and put the results of the AgiSoft into our unstructured lumograph renderer, you get the following result. And here you can see that the silk obviously has a much richer, almost metallic appearance to it, and there are also metallic threads in the eyebrow and in the iris that's surrounding the eye in this particular cap. So if you just take the output of PhotoScan, you're not going to get this kind of result. I mean, you need to actually go back to the original photographs in order to capture the kind of appearance detail that's here, and also the lighting that was used in the original photographic setup. I'll show you a second example of a sculpture, not a sculpture, but a bronze casting. And here you can see that PhotoScan kind of diminishes the effect of all the metal that's in this casting, and you lose a lot of the metallic appearance. But if you put the original photographs into an unstructured lumograph renderer, as you see here, you can actually see the richness of the appearance of this object, and also the original lighting that the photographer used to light the object. All this was done using the Turntable, the robotic system that Charles described previously at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So as we've been saying, this software was presented at Digital Heritage 2015, and we've made the software available for download for anyone who's interested. So here's the site address if you're interested in downloading it yourself, and I think Michael's going to try and distribute that via the chat to all of you. One thing that we would say is if you do decide to experiment with it, make sure that you've got adequate computing power and the right graphics card to use the software, and all that is documented on the website. So read the documentation carefully before you try and download it and install it. And we're very interested in feedback, and we'll provide as much support as we can to help you get going with it. And any bugs that you find, you can report to us, and we'll try and fix those as time permits. So I guess you want to let the discussion go until the end, so I'm going to turn this over to Michael Tetzlaff, who's going to talk about work that he's been doing in research. Michael was a contributor, as was Seth, to the developer of this render that you've just seen demonstrated. And his research now is to extend the back end that we've been producing so that you can actually relight the object from the photographs that you take. So with that, I'll let Michael take over and describe his recent work, which is going to be presented, I should say, at the Computer Graphics and Cultural Heritage Conference. It's going to be in Italy in October. Michael?
Thanks. So I'll start off by just showing, an object that Charles and I about a year ago captured in the gallery to do photogrammetry on when I was doing some work at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And so we can see here that you have some photographs here of this object, and it's very large. It is like too big to obviously put on the turntable. You can even see that in reference to the CHI scale bars and some of the other things in the background, that this object is quite large. And we actually captured it by just mounting a light onto the camera so that we have this sort of on-camera axis flash illuminating the object. And you can sort of see that the quality of the image is indicative of that. You can sort of see bright highlights in the center of the image, and it gets darker as you go away from both the center of the image and from the straight-on illumination. And we can just throw that data into our renderer and that Gary just demonstrated. And this is just what it would look like if we did an animation of sort of the backscattering rendering, where we have the light on the camera axis. And this is fine. This is something that you could do with the existing software. But we wanted to go beyond that. So our current development, we are trying to relight the object so that you can see it from more interesting lighting directions. And so now, what we're seeing now is where we actually have 3 synthetic lights in the scene, but we're still using those original backscattering illumination images. And you can see as it turns around, you can see some of the lights hitting it from behind. And so this is a much more general solution. And to clarify, this is not currently a feature in the existing tool. You can, as you can see here, move the light around, and you can still see the shininess. If you just use PhotoScan's texture, you wouldn't get sort of shininess there, on the gold parts of the object. But so our goal is to sort of be able to maybe release this at some point, in like a 2.0 version of the unstructured lithograph rendering software. So that's still quite a ways out, no plans to do that in the near future, but we thought we'd just give you guys a peek at where the direction that we're taking this in the future. We don't want to just stop at being able to change the viewpoint and see the original images. We want to actually be able to construct new images with new illumination conditions like this. So as the video finishes, we have a few more images here that I can show. Again, this is the tiger hat that Gary just showed. That one was actually another data set that we captured with the backscattering, on-camera axis flash. And so we can actually see it from, different illumination conditions. Here's a completely different one where a big part of it's in shadow. And we can synthesize this with the software that I'm developing right now. Similarly, we can do that with the horse and rider. Do 2 quite different illumination conditions, and then the viewpoint can be changed independently. We can also add colored light sources, to see what it would look like under, more unusual lighting conditions. And then here's another object, a double owl U vessel. I think that Charles even may had in one of the earlier slides, with a number of different illumination conditions. So that's what we've been working on. Again, right now the unstructured lumograph rendering software is available so that you can change the viewpoint and view any existing images that you have from PhotoScan, in a more dynamic way. And we're hoping that, at some point in the future we can get this relighting software out to the public again.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Michael and Gary. I mean, you can see why we're really excited about this technology that they're developing, because it certainly is a much more realistic rendering of the of our objects. And of course, it takes a lot of photographs to do this and a lot of process steps. And so that's why we invited Seth here, who's working on something called the PhotoScan Helper, which kind of helps us keep all of this, all of these captures organized and smoothly working through the processing steps. So Seth, why don't you take it from here?
All right, thanks, Dan. Just this previous summer, I showed off some of what PhotoScan could do to our local archivist here at UW Stout. And they were very intrigued by just the possibilities of taking the archives that we have here from, instead of just being a place that holds old newspapers and lots of flat media, to actually saving and preserving three-dimensional objects more. And so we set out with them, hired a few students to take a whole bunch of photographs. And we just sort of dove into it head first. They were all done handheld. We did not have the kind of equipment that Charles showed you. We simply wanted to push this to its limits and see how far we could go. Most of these were photographed in local museums here in Menominee, and we found ourselves staring at about 1 terabyte worth of photographs, and not a whole lot of manpower to be able to process those with PhotoScan. So, as many of you may be familiar with, PhotoScan itself has many stages to its process, and each of those requires a sort of set of human eyes to make sure that the process completed successfully, and that it's prepared to move on to the next stage. And so we only had 2 students, undergraduate students, that were able to do the actual processing, and we found that the man-hours for this were well beyond what we were able to provide to it. Now, in addition to this, I have been working on my own to try and secure some funds to build a system, not necessarily like what Charles does, but with the same goal in mind, so that we could capture things much more quickly. And as part of that, I proposed writing some software that would solve this problem, where we have tons of images that we need to put through PhotoScan and actually process them more efficiently, and not have to have someone sit there and wait through all the hours that it's spending working on aligning the photographs, extracting the dense cloud, and all the other information that PhotoScan does a really great job of extracting from these photographs. I've already begun developing this as part of solving the problem we currently have with 1 terabyte of photos that we aren't able to really get through. So I'd like to show you what we've achieved so far, and with the understanding that this is something that we will move towards in developing as we become more comfortable with this. As Dan mentioned, this is called, we're sort of colloquially calling it PhotoScan Helper. And it begins by having well-organized photos, which is something I found is easy to count on from photographic studios, and really just keeping things well organized was an important part of this. So I'll show you first what we have in our own photo setup here. So each of these represents a single object that you're seeing here. In each of these directories, we numbered them and kept track of each one as we photographed it. And then within that are just the photographs that are meant to be used, or that were taken for this. Sometimes we have within these the original raw photographs and then the developed photographs underneath it. And then, if one exists, we have a PSZ file, which is the older native format for PhotoScan itself. So as long as you have this sort of organized directory of objects, you can then plug PhotoScan Helper into this and examine all of this and gain a lot of information from it without having to actually go into PhotoScan itself. So it begins by asking you where your photo is located. That's what we're looking at here. I'm pointing it to the exact directory I just showed you. And it's going to go through and scan all of the information in there. It looks to find as many photos as it can, as well as any PSZ files, and we're also working to support the newer PSX format as well. However, we shot this a year ago when PSZ was still a standard, so all the ones that we're looking at today are just PSZ files. And so it pulls out of this as much information as it can. Now, there's a few things in here that are actually a little bit dated, because this particular directory that I'm looking at has some dirty information in it. But it just want to sort of show you here that we are actually scanning the data that is in this directory. So some of these things that are listed here, you'll see there are some duplicates, as well as some that don't have IDs in them. And this was all just because there's some things left out there in that directory that weren't relevant. But we can quickly glean through. It tells you the earliest date found in the photographs of when it was shot. It counts both the exposed and the raw images, so that you can see if there's parity there, that the same number are found. This gives you just a quick and easy way to look through and see everything. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. We, in fact, go quite a bit further. Buried inside this, I have an option to show even more information. Now, this is a good deal of information, so this is why I sort of have this hideable if you don't need to see it. But here we're now looking at information that's pulled out of the PSZ file about how far this has been properly processed with PhotoScan. First, we have a status level that says at what stage in the process it's at. Has it had image alignment? Has it had proper dense cloud generated? Has the mesh been generated? Has texture been generated? That is all indicated in this column here, and it's pulled right out of the PSZ file. And then it tries to give you information from that file about how what settings were used when this was processed. Now, as I said before, some of this is still in development, and there's a few things in here that are not working correctly. In particular, the model column is still not showing us any information, but this is something that we are working to develop so that at each level you'll know what settings were used. So here in image alignment, we can see, for instance, the high detail setting was used, and then for those that have delved into the more advanced settings, you can see 40K tie points were used with a total of 4K points shared between them. This is shown so that you know these are settings that when you change them can have a profound effect on the convergence of this phase. It also shows you how many images were successfully aligned in this particular case. I'm going to see if I can find one that actually has a different number than the actual number of images over there. And again, this is another thing that we're working to sort of reverse engineer what's inside of the PhotoScan file to make sure we're giving an accurate number here. And so some of these, here's a good example. There's 119 images, but only 106 of them aligned. This is largely due to the fact that, again, we didn't have a nice camera gantry system. This was shot by hand. And so we do have some images that simply failed to align. It was also shot by students. Sometimes the students didn't use the proper settings in the cameras. None of them had been trained by Carla or used the proper sort of practices in pulling these out. So we always have to look at that and make certain that a few of them are coming through correctly. You can see here also the dense cloud attempts to show you what kind of detail was used, and you can see a lot of ours get processed on low detail because we do not have a very powerful processor and don't have all the time to wait in order for this to be turned into a dense cloud. And then many of these I've flagged to the person that ran this that yes, you now need to redo the dense cloud so that it has higher detail. So I also use this as a communication tool to those that are processing it. Now, in addition here, it tells us which ones have textures and what resolutions those are at. We've always just done a single texture on ours, but it does support pulling out multiple textures. If you do the four, most of the MIA's models are using 4 textures instead of just 1. The last thing that I've done with all of this is attempted to go in and actually pull out some of the data. So another thing that gets frustrating when you have all of this available is actually looking at the models that have been generated. And so with this, I can go in and immediately select View Model here, and it will go and interrogate the PSC file and pull out the actual model. Now, this is not rendering it in the way that Gary and Michael just showed. This is still just the standard model with a texture on it, but it pulls it right out of it, and without having to load up PhotoScan, I can examine a lot of details about this particular model and see what it really has given to us. I can just have sort of a basic 3D viewer of the results that are available here. This particular model was a student project here at Stout that was created many years ago of just sort of a steam engine mock-up. It always defaults to the most traditional way to render the information, but you do have many other options. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to show you some of the other things that we provide out of here are just sort of visualizations that allow you to visualize the positions in space in this case, or allow you to look at the actual surface quality, because the texture can actually mask a lot of imperfections in this. This particular model was one of the very first ones we shot where the students were still learning, and a lot of the images did not align properly. So you can see there's quite a bit of noise in the surface of this one, and when we turn on this particular view of it, that becomes very apparent. But when we're in the more traditional viewing of it using the texture, almost all of that is masked by the texture. So this gives you a good way to sort of visually assess the quality of what you're working with. Much of this is available, of course, within PhotoScan or within other tools like MeshLab. My real goal here was to bring this all into a single unifying tool. Now, one of the larger goals with this is also to support that workflow. So not only does it let you see where you are, for our purposes, before we had the software, we had a spreadsheet that looked exactly like this and showed us all this information. And keeping that spreadsheet up to date was never easy. So now, originally this was just meant to duplicate that spreadsheet. Now what we have also on top of that, we're starting to develop options. These are all still work in progress, where we can come in and work with this and do several different phases of the process. So the initial phase for us is always just exposing those raw images. We use open source tools to do that, a program called DC Raw. And I can come into this, select that option, and it gives me all the different settings that I need to do this. It also will eventually provide a preview of the results, so you can check things like visual check of white balance. And the most important thing is it then consistently applies those settings to every single image, so that you are maintaining sort of consistent light fidelity in all of the different images that you're processing. This can also be, as we see down here, queued up. So you can set your settings and then you can queue it up. And you could queue up a whole bunch of these and then run the queue, so that this can then be an unmonitored batch process that you can be set up to run while someone goes off and does something else. If anything goes wrong, the idea is that this would be robust. It would then set that aside for you to check later, and it would continue on and run the queue, so that this doesn't become a blockable process where errors sort of make the whole workflow come to a halt. Now, more importantly, in addition to that, while exposing the raw images is important for us, since we aren't photographers, we have a piece for that. We also are aiming to automate PhotoScan, so that we can then send it into PhotoScan, and we've sort of broke it down into two phases where we found there was a need for human eyes. The first phase being everything up to image alignment, to make sure that image alignment works successfully, and then all the way to a model after that. And of course, this could be broken down in different stages, but that was what we found in our workflow was most useful. That part is still in development, but again, you could queue up these processes, have a bunch of them sitting there, and then leave it to churn overnight, and it would be robust in so much as if one of them fails or stalls, it would be set aside, and the other ones would continue, so that you get as much effective use of the resources you have available. So this was ultimately, this is just in the very early stages of development. I have put this out there as an open source project that is available on GitHub, but it is very much not for the faint of heart. It's only meant to be used by people that are willing to compile and make this on their own. But the goal is eventually to provide it in a way very similar to how we've put the ULF renderer out there. This is going to be in active development over the course of the next couple of years as we work to set up our own camera capture system that will be different from what Charles has, but with the same idea that we can capture these things very systematically, so that we build up towards a tool that can process all of these with as little human interaction as possible, or at least maximizing the use of our processing resources and minimizing the amount that human beings have to be involved in that process. Now, on the other end of all of this, let's stop sharing here first. I'll get our hollow mirror effects. There we go. Thank you. So now, on the other end of all of this, we're also very interested in how we turn this into something that can be shared with users, so that once we have a final piece available, making that something that can be posted to a website and be accessible by users. And while we've very much at present gravitated towards the same things that Charles has in terms of sharing through Sketchfab, since we come to this from an archival standpoint, and one of the people that has championed this work so far is the archivist here at our library, having the data stored locally and in our possession and in something that we can validate and verify on our own is a primary goal. So we are looking to develop something that would fill that void as well, and make it easy to put these out there and share it on a server that's in our control, and present an interface that also provides a means to not only enhance what's available, but also is focused on the archival purposes of it and on the cultural heritage that's involved in all of the pieces. All of this is, again, this is proposed work that's still in development in my own department here with our students. But we're working towards that, and it's something that we very much want to keep working with Charles and the MIA in terms of making their data available as well. So there's much more to talk about all of that, but at this point I'm happy to sort of hand things over to the next phase here, and we can start answering questions, I believe.
Yeah, well, we Thanks, Seth. That's really great. We're really excited about that. Really helpful for us to keep this all organized. But I wanted to, before we give Carla a chance to talk about how she's working with you guys to get this into the hands of some of you in the community, I thought we would just briefly talk about how we're sharing models now. And so let's turn that over to Charles, and maybe you can kind of show us, Charles, what we're using as sort of a place to share the content in the meantime as we wait for further development on some of the more sophisticated models.
Sure, Dan. Let's actually do this way. I've just sent the links to Kurt for both our Thingiverse and our Sketchfab presences. It's just search ArtsMia, A-R-M-I-A, on either Thingiverse or Sketchfab, and then you can see all of our models, because the things I have built into the presentation there are just screenshots of those. But we're using Sketchfab primarily and as a venue to be sharing these objects in the short term. And we have here at the museum, we have a couple things in development where we can where we're looking to have it as a more universal platform, where it's on available on our iPads and available on our website and all of that. And so we have a project that we're working on where we're figuring out how to get 3D into that. You know, we already have gigapixel images into there through the open source plugins that we've used, and we're looking to do the 3D in the same way. But in the short term, we're sharing on, like I said, mostly on Sketchfab, but also if you want to 3D print any of our objects, you can go to the Thingiverse and find the objects that I've optimized for 3D printing. So that's the short version.
And just for everyone to know, in this showcase on the left, anyone watching online on the left, you should see links to the MIA's Thingiverse and Sketchfab, as well as a link for the UFL renderer as well.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to mention that, of course, with the lumographs, with the light field renderings, one of the big challenges is how to deliver all of this dynamic content via a browser. And so that's one of the challenges ahead of us. But you know, for the exhibition, we do want to be able to share some of this content with our public. And Gary suggested something to us that we followed through on, and that was we worked with a student at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design recently, and we gave him the camera positions for one of the objects, and then he created an animation in Maya. I can share that with you right now. Now, I don't know if Gary and Michael have seen this yet. Now, this is just a quick fly-through on one of the objects. It does not have the texture on it yet. That's something Michael's going to do. He's going to apply the unstructured light field renderings on top of that. But let's see. That's right here. So this would be one way, and this was a suggestion that Gary gave us. This would be one way of us to kind of share this in an in-gallery experience or online without having to, you know, deliver everything dynamically. Let's see if it plays for us here. All right, wait a second. I think I have to go into this. And just bear with me while I find that window. Let's close this. There it is. So, and this is just a Maya animation. So, have you seen this, Gary, yet?
I just saw it this morning.
Oh, you
I'm
did?
very excited. I mean, we're excited about being able to, you know, render this out with the light field renderer.
And you know, we were thinking that, you know, this is just a first shot at this, but we were thinking if we talk with Yang Lu, the curator, he could, you know, do a narration and point out specific, you know, details about the object that then we could, you know, use as a voiceover for some of this, which I think would be a really great experience for in gallery. So now let's, Carla, I thought maybe we would give you a chance to kind of talk about your collaboration with with Gary's group and how you're going to help us maybe disseminate all of this to the community who you're in very good contact with.
Sure. And actually, if you guys don't mind, I'd like to just kind of take a minute and comment on a few things that have happened here. First, this is great. It's great to see all of this incredible work going on and synergies around different things. One thing that I want to really sort of drive home, in case it isn't clear to people, about why I think the work that Gary and Michael and Seth have been doing is so important, because it's really empirical based on your photos. So people can take models into tools like Maya and Blender and other things and create these sexy surfaces that look metallic and all that, but they're not based on your original photographic empirical data. So this is what's really cool about the work here, is that they're going back to your image set that you shot of the object in order to create these much richer experiences of the true surface. So I just want to hammer that point, because I think it's part of what makes this work so exciting.
Can I just chime in real quick, because there was a question before that I think kind of goes along with this.
Sure.
Ken Warnahal Singh Gill, he asked, how do we handle post-processing of the data, and do we outsource it to other services, or do we do it in-house? But I think that what you're implying, if I'm correct, is we don't want to do that much post-processing to clean up the model beyond getting it right initially in PhotoScan, and let others clean it up if they want to. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, so I guess I'm saying, well, they're, in some ways, they're slightly unrelated, because when most people think about cleaning up the model, I think they mean trimming things out or hole filling or things like that, which are a little bit unrelated to how the texture is. I mean, they're related. But in our case, in our work, as much as possible, we try to avoid all of those steps and just collect the images properly, process them. But in PhotoScan, if you just make a texture map, that texture map's going to look kind of dull, partly because you're taking these very flat lighted images, partly because it helps give you better geometry. And what these guys are doing is really being able, and plus just in general, PhotoScan, the way it makes a texture map, can't really include the richness of the surface the way that the light renderer does. So my point is that sometimes when people have a 3D model, they'll take it into, when they're finished with the photogrammetry part, or laser scanning, or however they created it, they'll take it into a third-party rendering system like Maya, Wavefront, there's a bunch of them, Blender's an open source one, and they'll put a surface on it, and they'll give that surface characteristics like metallic, render it to look metallic, but that's all just done in a rendering environment. It's completely virtual. And what these guys have done is go back to your original images, so it's based on the empirical data that you shot of your subject, which is giving people a more accurate and realistic way of looking at that subject, rather than just, oh, somebody with an artistic, creative bent thought it would look good to make this look more bronze or more shiny, right? So it's that the fact that when you're using the tools these guys are creating, you're really looking at tools that are going back to the original photos, rather than just rendering them in the kind of tools that people use when they're making games and movies and so forth. So I think that's a huge improvement from kind of what we've had in the past. I want to follow up on Seth's work, because he and I have talked about it briefly, but this is the first time I've actually seen it demoed, and I'm excited to see some of what's going on. And actually it works hand in hand with some tools that we're working on. At Cultural Heritage Imaging, we've been doing something we call the Digital Lab Notebook, and our initial work in that area has been focused on reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI data sets. We very recently got a grant from the National Park Service to take the tools that we've developed for RTI and modify them to support photogrammetry image sets. And so we're doing two things there in the current grant, and we have some proposals out where we hope to get funding to do even more stuff in this space. But one tool is about collecting metadata about what you're shooting and why and who's involved in your equipment and so forth, and then mapping that to linked open data. And we are actually using the SciDoc conceptual reference model as well, and for some of you that may be alphabet soup, but there it is. The second thing, which I think is the maps with what Seth is doing more directly, is a tool we call the inspector. And so we're looking at image sets and comparing the metadata, like your camera settings, but also your processing settings when you create your JPEGs or TIFFs from your raw images, and making sure that they follow a set of rules, and so we can find errors and warnings and things in an automatic way through the data sets. So what we want to do is collaborate with Seth to make sure that we're looking at kind of how the images are structured on the hard drive in ways that we can make recommendations so all these tools can work on the same kinds of images. So that's kind of exciting. And then in general, making the software available as a download from our website, the rendering environment, and we're going to keep looking at that. Does that add value to do that? At the moment, people can get it that want it. And also, I don't think you guys have said this, but you're planning to make the source code available as well. And then finally, along those lines, we also run free user forums that are mostly about RTI, though there's starting to be more of a photogrammetry presence there. And if there's enough interest with the rendering tools, we can easily set up a forum there where people can kind of publicly answer and ask questions and find information about using the tools. We found that super helpful with the RTI tools that are open source, that people have a place to go to kind of figure things out when they find a bug or when they get stuck. So I think that's all I want to say, other than great work, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Kurt, are there any questions out there?
Well, we just finished one up. Let's see. One thing I want to point out, if anybody watching does want to ask a question, probably up here there's a 3x3 square grid. If you click on that, there's a Q&A option. So if anybody wants to ask a question, please go ahead, click on that, ask your question, it'll show up and we'll ask it. But the question that the one question Carla kind of answered, and I'm curious if anyone else wanted to chime in on that, was, do you see a need for post-processing? They were asking specifically, do we outsource or do we do it in-house? But
right, and I noticed, they mentioned Clean My Scan as a particular service, so I think that gives some context here to what they're meaning in post-processing. It very much is a model cleanup service. So ultimately, at least from our end of this, because our things were shot handheld, we did find that many of our models did require some cleanup, some hole filling, and because a lot of the models that we were capturing didn't have sort of a need for perfect sort of empirical representation, we did do some in-house processing. In our school, we do have a fairly large design college here, and we did have some students come in and work with those models inside of ZBrush and Maya and actually clean them up manually. But that was mostly due to the fact that they were shot by hand, and because the students that were working with them were not using best practices when they were captured. I found that when a gantry system is used similar to what Charles has, and when very careful practices are taken, like what is taught by Chi, that there often isn't need for cleanup of the model itself. There is some cleanup that maybe needs to be done inside of PhotoScan to clean up the cloud, but very often post-processing of the model itself is not necessary.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, almost everything we shoot is handheld, and we don't have a fancy turntable setup like me, although I love their setup and I love the results they're getting. You don't have to have a big fancy setup like that to get good results. So we're just using turntables that we have marks on them every 10 or 15 degrees so that we can move them by hand. I mean, the camera is on a tripod, so the camera's locked down for the turntable projects, but most of our larger projects and outdoor projects are all either handheld or on a monopod, so that we can get height up and down. And really, the key thing to getting a good result is about following good practice in how your lens choice, and then good overlaps, 2/3 overlap of your images, and how you sort of lay out that sensor network, and then your camera settings. So there's a combination of things that you can do to get really high quality results with the surface being really correct, and it does not require the kind of setup that Mia has.
Yeah, I wanted to mention in reference to the question too that cleaning up the models is maybe not as much of a challenge as having the horsepower to process the models in any kind of volume. I think most photo studios are well acquainted with what it takes to clean up models and have the software and computers to do it. But I think when it comes to processing the models, that's been our challenge. Wouldn't you say, Charles?
Yeah, absolutely. But cleaning up the models in 3 dimensions is a different thing. So I think we're going to end up, as we start talking. Oh, and Carla, I wanted to see if you would mention the Cloud Compare software that you've been using, because I think with the models that we're always having little holes underneath where the feet were if we only shot the object right side up, and so we have to fill those gaps with something. And we're going to need to come up with a standard for what it looks like where you had to fill something in. You know, so I want to know if this model was, you know, came straight out of PhotoScan, and so I can assume it's really accurate except for the underside of it, or if the thing is totally totally accurate. And I understand, Carla, that you're working on something with in Cloud Compare where you can essentially visualize the accuracy of the data in 3 dimensions.
Okay, I think you get, well, I think of this as 2 different things.
Yeah.
So one thing is, if you do need to fill holes, like there's just something you couldn't get. We just, it's part of a class project, shot a large sculpture, and we just didn't have a way to get a camera up top, so there's a hole across the top of this thing. Same thing with the bottom sometimes. Our sort of general principle idea is that you shouldn't try to fake it, that it should be obvious that those things are, you know, just you put a flat plane over it or whatever to kind of you know, fill out the model. And I would say the same thing with other kind of hole filling. Just as conservators, you know, 100 years ago when they tried to recreate, let's say, a bunch of potsherds into something that looked like the original thing, they really wanted to look like the original thing. And now the thinking is, and we support this, that you want the pieces that are original and old to appear as they do, and then you want any things that you've done to fill in to be a completely different color, different surface, so that it's obvious to somebody looking at it what were the original parts and what were the added-on parts. So I would just say, regardless of the tools that you use, that's our general philosophy, is that it should be clear to people looking at something what was created from your, you know, empirical acquisition versus what was created by hand. Now this gets a lot trickier when you start talking about, you know, people just working on models and trying to clean them up and make them look good. And so this has been a huge issue in 3D, not related to photogrammetry, but, you know, lasers, structured light scanning, all forms of 3D collection. How is it that you tell the user what's empirical and what you added? Well, there are whole conferences on this topic, so we can't really solve it here other than to point out it's an important thing to look at. And I'll add that's, you know, Sketchfab is great. It's kind of the YouTube of 3D models. But what we're hoping is that there becomes a way for people to put models out that have this kind of metadata and information that helps, you know, people that are trying to use this data for research or historic documentation to understand what they're looking at. And there are a couple efforts in this direction. One is the 3D HOP, or 3D Heritage Online Presenter tool, which has been developed in Pisa at the Visual Computing Lab. Those are the guys that make Mesh Lab as well, and they also wrote the RTI viewer. And this does support RTI data, 3D data, and they're really trying to look at how to make metadata be more surfaced for the user, and it's used in the Ariadne project and some other projects. And then there's a brand new tool. I haven't really had a chance to look at it, but just last week out of Yale, the computer graphics group there with the Institute for, what's it called, Preservation. Come on, Kurt, what's the name of your institute?
Yale Center for the Institute for Preservation of Cultural Heritage at Yale's Institute for Preservation of Cultural Heritage.
Right. So that group, in conjunction with computer graphics, just released an open source viewing environment that supports 3D models, RTI, spectral data, all kinds of stuff, and they have a whole annotation system and metadata system that goes with that. So, like I say, just brand new. Haven't really had a chance to dive in, but I think that we're starting to see these efforts that are very much focused on supporting research so that they fill in these gaps that are missing in tools like Sketchfab and Thingiverse.
Right. I have a couple things here. All right. David Niekirk asks specifically to Carla, is Cultural Heritage Imaging developing color and gray charts for 3D photogrammetry?
Nope, that's kind of outside of our area of expertise. We just use off-the-shelf, color and gray cards. We do produce calibrated scale bars, and the reason that we did that is because we didn't feel like there was a good option out there for people in that, for that tool that was really designed for this use. And we collaborated with the Bureau of Land Management in Denver, the National Operations Center folks, on the design of the scale bars. So in general, we have like just a couple products that we produce, and it's generally because there isn't a solution out there, and people say, hey, can you guys come up with a solution? Not aware of a huge need for something new with color, grayscale. Specifically for photogrammetry, we're just using the standard, color workflows that are out there.
And Kurt, if I may, I think we're going to have a need for that in the future. Because I would like to know when you have your light sources, if you can document in the images, if you can document their specularity, and then a 3D Macbeth or X-ray chart would also have it would have a chrome ball and a black sphere in it and a ping pong ball, so that you could see all of those, how the light is affecting each of those, to give you some idea of what the lighting situation was for the original images.
Yeah, that's true, and there are some folks working on some things in that space. I don't know that they're working on a product so much as research in that area.
Right on.
Yeah, Don Williams, we just saw him out at Stanford a little bit ago, but he's out of Imaging Science and Associates out of Rochester. But he had a couple black, gray, and white little sugar cube-sized cubes, and he's also had some spheres in the past that he's basically at this point kind of putting them out there and seeing how people would use them and how they would be useful. And there's definitely potential there, but I think it's in the very early days. We're not at the point of, oh, here's a Macbeth color checker and use this. Rich House just wanted to point out that he's had success building models from a brightened image set for the 3D data of darkened original models, and then applying that as a texture to the same image set in order, with a correct color balance and exposure to kind of improve, I guess, the texture. It's, obviously not ULF relighting, but, that's his kind of workaround for now.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, we've kind of gone over the hour now, and so I'll just take the opportunity to thank all our presenters today, and also for all the people listening and tuning in and asking questions. I also want to mention too, MCN is the Museum Computer Network Conference is in New Orleans this year, the first week of November. Carla and I will be doing a presentation there, so we encourage anybody who has not been to MCN to consider coming, and otherwise we hope to see the rest of you there, maybe. And if there's nothing else, I'll just want to thank everybody, and especially Kurt for doing all the control of the Google Hangouts, which was a little challenging for us at first. It was a new platform for all of us. But we got through it, and I think it worked out pretty good. So thanks again, everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you,
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.